Aloha. Hi, everybody. Happy Monday and happy May. We are getting ready to start our mental health book club for April, even though I know it's May, so that's a little confusing. But I wanted to share, and last week was a crazy week for me, so I didn't have a chance to do the live, but I wanted to share a little bit about Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly. And I'm obsessed with this book, and to be honest, I could probably talk about it for like a solid 45 minutes to an hour. I'll try to keep it semi-short, but I have a lot to say because there are just so many gems in her book. Like, it's incredible. So first off, just the title alone, right? Daring Greatly, and it's how the courage to be vulnerable transforms the way we live, love, parent, and lead. And oh my goodness, she like just nails it again and again. So she starts the book talking about sort of the metaphor of being in the arena. And she shares this Theodore Roosevelt quote that I wanted to start with because I think it's important to just understand that before we go a little deeper into what she's talking about. So the man in the arena basically is this quote. Theodore Roosevelt said, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." So super powerful. The first, question that I wanted to pose to everybody, and I welcome any comments, anybody who's watching, or if there's anything you want to share about takeaways that you, what stood out to you from this book, please just share them in the comments. I really love hearing that. But the first question was basically, what does it look like to step into the arena in your own life and dare greatly? I think that for myself, and I can only speak for myself, daring greatly for me in my life has looked like, 3 years ago, or 3.5, I guess, I left a very reputable job, secure job actually, to become an entrepreneur, to start a private practice. And I left that job because it really no longer served me. And it was terrifying and really scary actually to go out on my own. But it was also the best decision of my life. And that for me was taking a huge leap. It was very much daring greatly and stepping into the arena of my own life, as was, to be honest, starting this Facebook group. I had no idea like how it would be received. To be honest, like it's funny because as I was going through this and just preparing for this live, I was even remembering just how nervous I was to kind of put myself out there in this way. This is, I'm a teacher sort of by trade, and so I do love talking and sharing and whatnot, but this was sort of a new platform for me, and so I was incredibly nervous to start this group, and I feel like it has been so well received, and I feel super supported, both by, colleagues from my former job and colleagues that are in sort of a similar profession as me, as well as just my friends and my family and all of you out there. I'm just very grateful. But to be honest, running, a full-time private practice therapy while trying to build this online business, that to me is also stepping into the arena and daring greatly. But I think, it can look like a lot of things. I would love to know for you. Type into the comments if something comes to you, what does that look like for you? I think having hard conversations with people that we love is daring greatly. I think standing up for what we believe in, even when other people don't. I think that's daring greatly. Like, I think it can look like a lot of different things. And I'm just going to be really honest and take a vulnerable moment here, especially since this is Brene's whole thing. And I'll be talking about vulnerability in a moment. But again, as I was sort of preparing for this live, I have been putting off writing a very difficult letter for quite some time, at least a couple weeks. And last night, as I was going through this, I was like, I really can't get on camera and talk to everybody about vulnerability and daring greatly and stepping into the arena if I'm not going to do this myself. Like, if I'm not going to actually put myself out there in this way. And so actually, this was super motivating for me to write a really difficult, but also very healing letter to someone who I've been estranged from for a very long time. And so for me, that was daring greatly and stepping into the arena. So I would love to hear what that looks like for you. I think the big thing that Brene Brown talks about is she sort of, emphasizes, so I'm going to read a quote because this is one of her quotes. She says, "Nothing has transformed my life more than realizing it's a waste of time to evaluate my worthiness by weighing the reaction of the people in the stands. The people who love me and will be there regardless of the outcome are within arm's reach. This realization changed everything." And I couldn't agree more. As we think about like who in our life, is in the stands with us, who's in the arena with us and who's in the stands. I think, for me personally, I think that there was a long time when I was younger and, in my teen years and young adult years even, where I was very, I don't even know what the right word is, I guess just sort of nervous or hesitant to really totally put myself out there because I was worried about other people's perceptions of me, which is normal, which is perfectly normal. But one of the things that really helped me was realizing I cannot control other people's reactions to me. Like, not everybody's going to love me or like me, and that's okay. But what I do have control over is choosing what I share with others and how I respond to them. And so, I think for me, like, I would say that there was a period of time where I was probably my harshest critic, where I was definitely like in the stands rather than being in the arena with myself. And Brene Brown echoes this. She says that's something she struggled with as well. So I wonder, like, how many of you see yourself in the stands criticizing and judging yourself when you are, doing something that's new and scary and taking a lot of courage. I think that the big message there for me with this whole Theodore Roosevelt quote and this metaphor of the man in the arena, again, is just sort of this idea that if we stopped evaluating our worthiness by the reaction of like critics in the stand, how would our life be different? Like if you stopped worrying about other people and their criticisms of you or their views of you, like how would that change your daily experience and what you do? And I know for me, like, again, taking this giant leap and putting all this out there, I'm doing this because I feel called to do this and because this feels important to me. And it feels, aligned with what I believe I'm called to sort of share and offer. But I have no idea how this is received, right? And so I can't control that. And so, what are the ways in your life where you could maybe stop placing so much emphasis or weight on other people's reactions or, evaluating your own worthiness based on the people who are in the stands, so to speak, right? Like in my arena with me are my closest friends, my closest family members, the people who I know like believe in me and support me, and I still have moments every now and again where I find myself in the stands, right? And where I find myself still being a little bit critical. And those are some of the old patterns, but working on it. And I've definitely gotten a lot better. But I think I'm a work in progress, just like all of you. And so I wanted to jump ahead because this is a big topic. So the next question, is basically, so she says, vulnerability, I love this quote, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage, right? So if we were to finish a couple of the sentences that I sort of prompted you guys with, I would love, again, anybody who's watching this live or a replay, put them in the comments. Vulnerability is ... Finish that sentence. For me, I would say vulnerability is strength. And I feel like in many ways, I think those of you who are watching this and who have read her book or who maybe are here in, this Facebook group, I think you probably would agree with me, but I would say it's very much like sort of a cultural norm that vulnerability is actually seen as weakness. But Brene Brown says that is not the case, right? She says vulnerability brings with it uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure, and that it is like the single most important factor in terms of creating connectedness and a sense of belonging to others, right? So for me, so the next prompt was vulnerability feels like ... right? And fill in the blank. I'd love to hear what it feels like for you. For me, it feels like courage, connection, and safety, which I realize is not always the case for people. I think vulnerability feels very scary for many people. But part of why that's my view and Brene Brown's view of vulnerability, having run many girls groups and women's groups, I have seen time and time again how all it takes is one person who's willing to be vulnerable and who's willing to share about themselves for other people to feel like a deep sigh and sense of relief, and to also be willing to share about themselves. And that's what creates connectedness, right? That's what creates connection, and a sense of community, really. And that, to be honest, is why I started this Facebook group. That's what I am hoping to create, are safe spaces for us to be vulnerable with each other, to be real and authentic. So I'll keep going here, but the next prompt was, I feel most vulnerable when, right? And again, I would love to hear from you. For me, I would say it's when I allow myself to be what I'm going to call like emotionally naked. Again, meaning when I feel like I am at my most raw emotional self. Maybe when I'm not, that's not necessarily my best self, but it is when I am probably my truest self, when that's when I'm most vulnerable. One of the things I really appreciate about this book is she talks about, and I'll get to in a minute, talking about sort of vulnerability armor, but she talks about this idea that we protect ourselves often, and it's unconscious, but from vulnerability, right? So like for me, the next prompt is, I protect myself from vulnerability by, fill in the blank, right? And for me, I think that this is sort of a, childhood coping strategy. I protect myself from vulnerability by appearing to have it all together. Like for me, I think perfectionism used to be my vulnerability armor, right? And I think, we all wear that armor in different ways, but when we, for me, when I, as a, teen or young adult, like feeling like I had it all together seemed in a way to somewhat like protect me from others, potentially like criticism or their, harsh perspectives of me. Over time, it has been so freeing to let that go and to stop wearing the perfectionism as my armor, and to just allow myself to be real and authentic. And so I'm just going to share this other quote that Brene Brown, that's from her book. She says, vulnerability is not weakness, and the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure we face every day are not optional. Our only choice is a question of engagement. Our willingness to own and engage with our own vulnerability determines the depth of our courage and the clarity of our purpose. The level to which we protect ourselves from being vulnerable is a measure of our fear and disconnection. Right? She has a way with words. She nails it. She also talks about this like vulnerability paradox, right? Where it's like, you show me yours, like your vulnerability, but you're not seeing mine, right? It's like the first thing we look for in others, but not necessarily are we willing to share that ourselves until we feel safe, right? And I understand that. I think, so Brene in this book says that the definition of courage is telling the story of who you are with your whole heart. And if your heart doesn't feel worthy or loved or engaged or even resilient, then you feel like you can't tell that whole story. I just wanted to share a quick story of somebody who I was truly awed by. Recently, I did a webinar. I was asked to be a speaker on a panel for student mental health in the digital age. And one of the other speakers on this panel with me is this woman. Her name is Ann Moss Rogers. She is this incredible woman who's a mom, and is now a TEDx speaker and an author. And she lost her son to suicide 7 years ago. And she is like the epitome of post-traumatic growth. Like, she has taken something that clearly was probably the most difficult thing she's ever been through in her life, and she now talks about it on a daily basis. And she does that because she knows that it helps other people. And I have to say, I've started reading her book, which I actually thought about being our May book club book, but I'm leaning towards a different book at this time. But if anyone wants to read Ann Moss Rogers' book, I highly recommend it. She has two. One is called Diary of a Broken Mind, and the other one is called Emotionally Naked, which is actually for teachers. And it's basically talking about sort of suicide prevention and the sort of dangers of addiction and challenges around mental health. But she, to me, is just like, again, the epitome of really like post-traumatic growth and what can happen when we're willing to tell our story, right? Like, we don't know how it's going to be received by others, but we know we don't even have a choice, that is really what we are being called to do. So the other thing I wanted to share, and this is one of the things that I love about Brene Brown's work. So she talks about sort of the antidotes. So she is a shame researcher and a vulnerability researcher, right? But she talks about that basically the antidotes to shame and to comparison, because I think we, especially as women, have this tendency to compare ourselves often to other women, but also just to others in general. And I see this a lot with young girls. But she talks about gratitude, self-compassion, setting boundaries, redefining our personal sense of success, cultivating connection, and seeking support. Like, all of these are antidotes to shame. One of the single, I would say, biggest ones that I see, though, is empathy. And I was just rereading or re-listening to her book earlier today, and she was on the part where she was talking about empathy as an antidote to shame. And like, it just, I'm just almost floored as I listen to her words, because, you know, ultimately what she's saying is that, you know, empathy and all of those tools, gratitude, self-compassion, all of those things basically help us to like rediscover our sense of self. They help us to like grow our sense of resilience when those demons of like shame and comparison want to take over, right? So in my own experience, I've found that, again, it's like when you're with a group of people, like, shame is perpetuated by silence, right? And so if we stay silent about topics like mental health or suicide or really difficult things, anxiety, depression, whatever it is that we're struggling with, addiction, the tendency is to stay silent, right? Because that's what our culture teaches us about sort of what is normal, so to speak. But actually, the thing that helps us more than anything else is to speak our truth and to have other people hear our story, to listen, to hold space for us as we share our story, and then to empathize and to know that we're not alone in what we're going through, because more often than not, we actually are all going through similar things, but sometimes we don't know it if we don't talk about it. So she says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It's the source of hope and authenticity. And I couldn't agree more. One of the things that she says, so our next sort of question that I wanted us to, or prompt or whatever that I wanted us to think about. So she talks about a culture of scarcity, and she says that basically a culture of scarcity is like at the core of many of our issues with vulnerability. And she has a name for these like never enough beliefs that we have. She calls them shame gremlins, and I love that. And I'll give you some examples of shame gremlins. But basically it could be sort of the belief that you're just not good enough, never enough, not clever enough, not beautiful enough, not strong enough. Maybe it's that you feel like you're not successful enough, not a good enough parent, not thin enough, not getting enough sleep, you don't have enough money, not enough time, you don't feel lovable enough, not enough social media followers, like whatever it is. There are so many ways that we buy into this sort of culture of scarcity. She calls it the never enough problem, right? And, you know, our shame gremlins, they're different for different people, certainly, but I think they all speak to us and they prevent us from being able to move forward and dare greatly. And so one of the things that she says is that when we are constantly comparing ourselves to other people, when we are like putting others on a pedestal of perfection and we're aspiring to be like them, we're only seeing like this much of their life, right? So like if there's someone who you follow, for example, on social media, or even somebody like Brene Brown who you look up to, we only know this much, right? Like we can't possibly know the whole truth about someone's life unless we sit down, talk to them, allow them to share. And so what happens, I think, is because we make a lot of assumptions based on like highlight reels of what we think a person's life is like, we have a tendency sometimes, because of those limiting beliefs, those never enough beliefs or shame gremlins, we like stop engaging with our hopes and our dreams, right? They seem unattainable to us. Like, look what she's doing, I can't do that. Sometimes we retreat, we like hide away, and we make ourselves small so that we're not drawing more attention to our own shortcomings or kind of inadequacies. And I think that it's hard. I mean, it's very challenging. I think sometimes when we feel scared to show our true selves, we're in a place where we're feeling not brave enough. That's another never enough, right? Not brave enough to be vulnerable, not brave enough to put ourselves out there again. But here's what she says, and I love her for this. She says, if the opposite of scarcity is enough, then practicing gratitude becomes the highest form of acknowledging that there's enough and that we're enough. And so this is why the practice of gratitude is so powerful. Like, I incorporate that in every meditation I do, in even just like a daily intention setting. I think gratitude in any form will take you out of the place of shame, out of the place of not feeling like you're enough. And it gives you sort of this courage, really, to step into your truth. And that's really, like, I think, to be honest, what we're here for. So the other thing, since we're talking sort of, again, the whole idea of like the critic in the stands, is that she talks about worthiness. And she's saying that basically, in simple terms, if they love it, you're worthy. If they don't, you're worthless. And that's sort of that belief, that sort of faulty assumption that we make, that, again, if we put ourselves out there and other people don't like what we're putting out there, then we're not worthy somehow. And it's interesting. I was, again, just re-listening to the part she talks about the difference between men and women. And for women, I think that the ways in which we, feel often not enough have to do with appearance, body image, mothering, parenting, which are obviously taken right from sort of our feminine norms. But men, for example, have their own pressures, right? I think men sort of struggle with the message of not being perceived as weak. And that is sort of where they almost struggle with their own culture of scarcity, or their own limiting beliefs, the idea that they cannot show weakness, which is why I think it's so hard sometimes for men to be vulnerable, and how beautiful it is when they are willing to show that side of themselves. And so what she says is that shame resilience is about finding a middle path, basically an option that allows us to stay engaged and to find the emotional courage that we need to respond in a way that aligns with our values. And I just love everything she has to say around shame resilience. I think it's just brilliant. And coming back to that concept of like vulnerability armor. So, she says what we don't see is that using vulnerability is not the same thing as being vulnerable. It's the opposite. It's armor. So if we're using our vulnerability as a way to almost like prevent people from really seeing who we are, then that's not really vulnerability. That's vulnerability armor. And so she shares about in her own life how, she really struggled in the beginning with being vulnerable. And that, what does she say? She says the way that she handled that like fear of vulnerability was trying to control things, and managing and micromanaging basically situations and people, and performing until there was no energy left to feel. And she says, I made what was uncertain certain no matter what the cost. I stayed so busy that the truth of my hurting and my fear could never catch up. I looked brave on the outside, but felt scared on the inside. And I have to say that I think this vulnerability armor is something I see often. I think that it's a coping strategy. I mean, she herself has been very open about her struggle with alcohol, and she's been sober for a number of years. But I think that like vulnerability armor can look like different things. For some people, it's staying crazy busy, just keeping yourself busy all the time so that you never have time to actually pause and be with yourself. For other people, it's like, again, needing to be in control, like just spending a lot of time and energy trying to make the uncertain certain so we feel like we know what's coming. I think a lot of us struggle with, there's so much uncertainty right now in the world, and just, with everything that's going on. I think that many of us feel like, gosh, we just want a sense of control. But I think that when we are, putting on a brave face, and we're not really stepping into our truth, I don't know if that really is necessarily like being in the arena. I think that, what she says, so I love this. She says to set down those lists of what we're supposed to do. Oh, I'm sorry. To set down those lists of what we're supposed to be is brave. To love ourselves and support each other in the process of becoming real is perhaps the single greatest act of daring greatly. And yeah, exactly. Like just forgetting about expectations for a minute and just being who we are, right? That's why I always talk about like being rather than doing, and how really that's like an art and a science of learning how to be rather than do. And, the other thing that stood out to me, she says, there's nothing that makes us feel more threatened and more incited to attack and shame people than to see someone else daring greatly. Someone else's daring provides an uncomfortable mirror that reflects back our own fears about showing up, creating, and letting ourselves be seen. And like, I know that that's been even true for me at times, that, I see people who are appearing, oh my gosh, like so successful in all these different ways. And if I allow the fear to take over and I allow the shame gremlins to come in, then I almost feel not worthy, right? But if I stop making it about them and I just focus on myself, which to be honest is something I share a lot with clients, is like, why are we so focused on that person? Let's come back to ourself. Or why are we so focused on what we can't control? Let's focus on what we can control, which is ourself, right? That is sort of a way to shift that. And the last thing here is, before we move on to the last couple questions, so she talks about numbing vulnerability, and basically that is incredibly debilitating when we feel essentially like we have to numb the vulnerability because we're so scared of it. So she says, numbing vulnerability dulls our experiences of love, joy, belonging, creativity, and empathy. We can't selectively numb emotion. If you numb the dark, then you numb the light, right? And so I think that that's a question just to reflect on for yourself is, what are the emotions that you try to numb in your own life? And what emotions would you like to experience more of? I would love, again, if you're watching the replay or catching this live, please, put in the chat, like, what's an emotion that you try to numb? Obviously, like, shame is a difficult one. I also want to point out, one of the things she talks about in the book is the difference between guilt and shame. And I think that's an important distinction. So basically, guilt is sort of this feeling of, I did something bad. Whereas shame is, I am bad. Right? So it's like the shame is sort of like feeling almost like all encompassing, like that's who you are, as opposed to guilt is more sort of a behavioral response. And I think that oftentimes we numb guilt and shame, I think those are emotions that we struggle with sometimes. Sometimes anger is another one we don't always know how to, connect with. But I would love to hear. And then I think that also begs the question of like, well, what are you doing to take care of those emotions, right? That's sort of the whole thing that I've been talking about in this group is, what are healthy ways to manage difficult emotions? So she says, are my choices comforting and nourishing my spirit, or are they temporary reprieves from vulnerability and difficult emotions, ultimately diminishing my spirit? Are my choices leading to my wholeheartedness, or do they leave me feeling empty and searching? And I would just say that, like, if you are finding yourself numbing, whether that is through, so it could be through alcohol, through, obviously substances, drugs, through food, through mindless scrolling on social media, that's numbing. That I would say, like, how is that serving you? Right? Like, how does that serve you? And what function is that serving for you? And are there other things that you would like to do to process or take better care of your emotional experience, your emotional body? Because I think when we are turning to those numbing types of behaviors, we're not really in our best self. We're not up, we're just disconnecting. It's a way to sort of distract and avoid, as opposed to really like moving through it, being present with it. And I know that that feels very scary for some people, but it actually, like, once we learn, you know, this goes back to our very first book club book, but Emily Nagoski in Burnout talks about how emotions are tunnels. And so there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to every emotion. So even the really difficult emotions, fear, shame, guilt, like even those really tough ones, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Like if we learn how to be with that emotion and talk through it and process it, even like move our body through it, that actually we can make our way out of that emotion. Okay, so there's so much more. I only have a couple more questions here for us to discuss, but I want to share this concept of the marble jar. This is like one of my favorite takeaways from this book. So she basically shares that trust is built one marble at a time. She says, we trust people who have earned marbles over time in our life. Whenever someone supports you or is kind to you or sticks up for you or honors you, or honors what you share with them as private, you put marbles in the jar. And I think she got this idea from like her daughter's kindergarten teacher or something like that. But she runs with it and I just love it. She says, when people are mean, disrespectful, or share your secrets, the marbles come out of the jar. We look for people who, over time, put marbles in and in and in until you look up one day and you're holding a full jar. And those are the folks you can tell your secrets to. Those are the folks you can trust with this information that's important to you. So I, would just ask you to take a moment and imagine, think about your relationships in your life, and imagine that each person represented a jar, right? And like, are you finding that the other person or the other people in your life are filling your jar with marbles? Like, are they marble jar friends, right? So actions of like trust and safety and responsiveness and celebration and love and support, like all of those things potentially add marbles to the jar. But then the things that might take a marble out of the jar, right, would be, someone who is not trustworthy and maybe who speaks ill of you or doesn't follow through with what they say they're going to do, or isn't a very good friend, And so I think there's so many ways that we don't even realize sometimes that we're not surrounding ourselves with conscious company, and what would our life look like if we did surround ourselves with marble jar friends, basically people who are always putting marbles into our jar rather than taking them out. And I think this is a huge, just important takeaway from this book, because in my experience, I think that if we are constantly surrounding ourselves, like who we are very much is reflected by who we surround ourselves with. If we're surrounding ourselves with people that constantly lift us up and build us up, then we feel confident, we feel strong, we feel supported. Whereas if we're surrounding ourselves with people that are constantly like taking marbles out of our jar and not treating us well, we're going to feel the effects of that, right? And that's going to take a toll on our mental health, on our well-being. And so I think it's just important to evaluate that, who are your marble jar friends, and why are you keeping people in your life that are not marble jar friends, that are not adding to the marbles in your jar? Okay, so let's see. The last question. So the last one is, she says, for those welcoming the experience, the shudder of vulnerability that accompanies joy is an invitation to practice gratitude, to acknowledge how truly grateful we are for the person, the beauty, the connection, or simply the moment before us. So I just wanted to invite you, I love in one of her sort of like workbooks that, or something that accompanies the book, she shares, when you are able to start to like name how you're feeling. So whether we're naming gratitude or we're naming our vulnerability, that actually can help us to start to feel a little bit more sort of strong, courageous, confident, right? All of those things. It builds us up. So I'm feeling vulnerable about blank, and I'm also grateful for blank, right? So like, if you just take a moment to think, like, where in your life have you been feeling vulnerable? And then also, what are you grateful for, right? And just how simple, like, that's a reframe. That's just a really simple way to reframe whatever it is that you might be struggling with, or whatever it is that you are maybe feeling somewhat vulnerable with. And maybe you have your own practices of gratitude. I would love to hear, like, what are ways that you practice gratitude in your everyday life? And what could you do differently to make space in your life for more gratitude and for more joy, right? And I know for me, just even like simple, before my feet hit the floor, just closing my eyes and placing a hand on my heart and just identifying 3 things that I'm feeling grateful for to start the day, like that changes your day, or before bed even, doing a similar practice, or around the dinner table, allowing everyone to go around. We don't have to just do that on Thanksgiving. We can share our gratitude and express how we're feeling. And there's so much research from the field of positive psychology that supports this practice of expressing gratitude as a way to build happiness. So I just wanted to take a moment. That's sort of, those were my takeaways from this book, but I thought we might do a really sort of short gratitude meditation just to close this out. So I'll just have you guys, close your eyes. I'm placing a hand on my heart and a hand on my belly. And let's just take a moment to take a few deep breaths. Notice the inhale and the exhale breath. Allow yourself to just be a sort of an observer of the breath. Feel the breath as it moves in through the nose and travels down, filling the low belly, filling that bottom hand. And as we exhale, the breath rises and releases out through the nose, taking with it any stress or tension or worry, anything that's not serving you. We release it with each exhale breath. Allowing ourselves to just be an observer of our experience without judgment. Just simply watching the inhale and the exhale breath. Notice what that feels like to ground into the body through the breath. Take a moment to just drop into that heart space and cultivate gratitude for this body, for your health. And then take the palms together and let's rub the palms and just feel some of the heat that's generated between the hands. And take a moment and just place the hands over the eyes. Just simple. Notice what that feels like, how that darkens the vision. And take a moment to just cultivate gratitude for that sense of sight. All the things that you see on a daily basis. Let's release the hands. We can rub the palms together, create some friction, some heat. Same thing, we're going to place the hands over the ears just for a moment. And feel the heat that's there. I'm going to take my hands off my ears so you guys can hear me, but just noticing what that feels like. Maybe it's a little bit, the sound is muffled, right? Just cultivating gratitude for the sounds that we hear on a daily basis, right? You might even, when you're ready, you can release the hands from the ears, and with the eyes closed, take a moment to just bring your awareness to any sounds that you hear. I just heard a bird chirping outside. Just take a moment to notice and be grateful for each sound, just moving your awareness from sound to sound. Cultivating gratitude for being here in this present moment. And then we'll rub the hands together one more time, create some friction. Let's place one hand over the heart and place the other hand over that. So both hands laying on the heart. And just this simple practice alone actually releases oxytocin, which is the bonding, the love hormone. Noticing what that feels like to just place your hands on your heart. cultivate some self-love, some self-compassion, gratitude for making time to get through this whole live, to listen, to read, to be part of this sisterhood that we've created here. And just take a moment to feel gratitude for anyone in your life who is a marble jar friend, who is conscious company. Feel grateful for all the ways that that person lifts you up and adds to your life and supports you in being your best self. And just reconnecting to the breath, we can release the hands, or you can leave the hands there if it feels good. Just taking another moment here to relax the body, just 5% more. Noticing if we're already anticipating what's coming next, the live ending, moving on to our next thing. Can we come back to the present moment and just be here now? Can we cultivate gratitude for the practice of vulnerability, for the gift of connection, connecting to ourself, connecting to conscious company. And whenever you feel ready, just begin to bring your awareness back to the hands, the feet, the body. Feel all the parts of the body that are touching wherever you're sitting, the floor, the chair, the couch, the bed. And just carry this feeling of gratitude with you as you go about the rest of your evening. When you're ready, you can release the hands and open the eyes. So whenever, I hope that was just sort of a nice grounding gratitude meditation for you. I hope that was enjoyable, and it certainly like grounded me. That felt really nice. And I just want to invite you guys, as you're watching or rewatching this, please feel free to comment. I would love to start a dialogue here, and just appreciate all of you who are here and participating, and whether you've read the book or you haven't read the book. I just invite you to continue to, reach out, and you can either comment or just, reach out to me even through Messenger. That's great. I love hearing people's takeaways from these, each of these books that we're reading. And I wanted to share, so the May book, which I'll be posting about later in the week, our mental health book club book for May is going to be a really powerful book, but it's in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, and that is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, sorry. So super powerful book. If you haven't read it, again, I'll be posting about it later in the week. So thank you guys so much for being here, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your evening. All right. Thank you. Aloha.